Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Common Sense with Dr. Ben Carson. I'm your host, Ben Carson. So delighted to be with you today. And we have a fabulous guest, Ms. Kimberly Ells. She's a researcher on family issues and a policy advisor. She has spoken to the UN on family issues and has written the book, The Invincible Family: Why the Global Campaign to Crush Motherhood and Fatherhood Can't Win. Can't wait to hear why that's the case. But welcome, Kimberly. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
You know, it's hard to believe that we actually have to argue for the importance of the family. But that's where we are these days. What made you write this book?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, there was an incident that kind of jolted me into action. About 10 years ago now, I was doing some other research online and I came across a document that I found to be very disturbing and concerning. And what it was a document promoting sexual rights for children, for youth. And I was intrigued, to say the least, and so I got looking into that and discovered that it was published by International Planned Parenthood Federation. And I thought, well, if this is in the mainstream now, I'm going to be in the mainstream fighting this, because the whole idea of promoting sexual rights for children and promoting children as sexual beings is very concerning to most parents, including myself, who am the mother of 5 kids. And so I decided that I was going to fight this agenda. And so with that in mind, I quite quickly, I think by the grace of God got connected with some other people who are already in this fight, even at the global level, at the United Nations, Family Watch International. I joined forces with them. And that's where my true education of what was happening at the global level against the family really started to bloom.
Yeah, well, you know, so many people around the world think of the United Nations as, you know, righteous and wonderful and the advocate of all good things. What surprised you the most about them and their attitudes?
Well, not everything the UN has done or has tried to do has been bad and terrible. And, you know, there's a quote that the UN is the world's last best hope for humanity. I disagree with that. I think that the family is the last best hope for humanity. And the things that I've seen unraveling at the United Nations are extremely anti-family, in many cases very anti-man, anti-gender, and anti-child. And in the name of women's rights, they actually enact a whole bunch of policies and programs that in the end up hurting women more than they help them. And one specific thing that is most concerning, that's related to what got me into this fight, is the promotion of what's called comprehensive sexuality education. And the powers that be at the United Nations have been trying very hard for very long to get this enshrined as a human right for all children. And the forces on the other side, the side that I've been fighting on, and my colleagues have been trying to keep that out of consensus documents, to which to this point we've been successful at doing. So kudos to many of the UN entities and ambassadors and representatives who are fighting for the family, but it is getting to be a very difficult fight.
Well, you know, it's interesting that, you know, the UN, they actually said to normalize pedophilia, or doing things to normalize it, by saying sexual conduct involving persons below the domestically prescribed minimum age of consent to sex may be consensual in fact, if not in law. I mean, that's that's pretty shocking stuff coming from the United Nations.
Right. And that's come out just recently. And I'm so grateful that this is coming to the forefront, because when I heard that, I said, well, of course, this has been the agenda for the past 20 years. And, you know, and I've been on board for 10 years. Let me give you another example. So the document that I cited just earlier that I originally found was called Exclaim. And there's a quote from that document that says, sexuality and sexual pleasure are important parts of being human for everyone, no matter what age, no matter if you're married or not, and no matter if you want to have children or not. And then it goes on to say that governments and leaders have a duty to protect and fulfill all sexual rights for everyone. So that's
Wow.
very clear as well. The quote you read is very clear, indicating that their belief is that minors can and should consent to sexual activity. And that's nothing new. I'm sad to say at the global level. The document I cited and many others clearly are influencing children, framing sexual pleasure as simply a human right for all people at all ages. And that's very concerning when you get into, okay, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for children? What does that mean for adults? What does that mean for, children having sexual contact with each other? It gets into all these kind of very sticky and very important issues that most parents are very concerned about, are very interested in. And so another document from the UN that came out in a revised version in 2018 is the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education. It's published by UNESCO, and it's meant to guide sexuality instruction throughout the world. And it is laced with sexual rights ideology, the idea that sexual pleasure is a human right. In addition to sexual pleasure, seeking sexual information and obtaining sexual services. Those are kind of three main areas that are considered sexual rights. And UNESCO and all the other logos of the UN agencies that are on that booklet agree. The World Health Organization, UNICEF, UNFPA, they are all on board with the children's sexual rights agenda. And we need to wake up to this. And in fact, over the past few years, most parents have been very concerned at what they've been seeing in their children's schools and schools across the nation. Well, what my book does largely is tell where that is coming from, where most of that is emanating from. It's not just a school here and there. It's a global effort to sexualize children and to legitimize that position and enshrine sexual rights for children as a human right.
Well, in the past, they've sort of implied anybody saying things like that, it was a conspiracy theory. But, now they're not even trying to hide it anymore. It's just right out in the open. I was at a school system, and I asked if I could see some of the books they were talking about. And I got to tell you, it was frank pornography for elementary school children. I couldn't believe my eyes. Mm-hmm. And this is actually being fed to them.
Right.
And it appears to be a global agenda.
Right. It is. And that's what I make clear in my book. And I show how that is in fact happening.
Do you think it's actually gaining credibility, pedophilia, or do you think people are smart enough to resist?
Well, I think two things. I think there's a huge push to legitimize pedophilia. However, and that's very concerning, and there's a lot of money and power behind it, and so we've got to fight that. But I've been very encouraged at recent events. As you mentioned, this recent quote that came out from the UN-backed document, basically with minors consenting to sex. There's been a huge outcry against that and about that. And as you'll recall, a few months ago with the Balenciaga scandal, where children were posed in this, glamorous brand with sexual objects and in sexual ways. And thankfully, most of the decent people of the world, parents or not, were not okay with that. So while there is a huge push to normalize these things and it is gaining steam, I think there's a great deal of common sense still coming to bear. And when it comes to sex and children, people and especially parents are not going to let that go forward. They're going to fight it.
Well, what do you think is the best way for parents to fight? I know some people are sitting there wringing their hands and saying, "Well, I'm just a single person. What can I do?"
Right. Well, there's many things we can and should do. And I'm going to start with the most basic, which many people kind of brush over like, oh, of course, maybe that. But no, the most important thing that each of us can do, and it's actually the most important thing to do, is to teach what we believe is right in our homes, in our families, to teach our children what we believe is right about gender, sex, marriage, and the family. And to do that regularly, to be addressing these issues. There's so many opportunities to talk about these issues with our children at age appropriate times. And we need to take those opportunities, and we need to create opportunities. And I don't mean just talking about logistics of sex or, sexual, birth control or contraception, although those things can certainly be talked about. What I mean is even something a little bit deeper. And that goes to the importance of sex as a power to create life. That's how new human beings are brought into being, is through sexual intercourse between a man and a woman. And that's very significant. And that is a weighty responsibility that people should be committed to one another before they engage in sexual intercourse or any sexual activity. And our children are not hearing that message. That used to be the common social message, right? That
Yes.
Marriage was the place where sex could appropriately take place. That bonds the family together. It creates children. It creates a natural cradle where children can be born into the best possible circumstances. But that message is almost nowhere to be found these days. So if we want our children to find and believe that, and to lead them down the path that'll statistically bring them to the greatest happiness and success in life, we need to teach them the weighty power of sex and the meaning of it, and the value of the family as a unit. And so it's helpful, if we as families find people to associate with, either in a neighborhood level or church level or whatever, that we can surround ourselves with people who are like-minded. And I think as these choices are becoming more stark, people will emerge, in our lives that we can align with, because it is difficult for our children to stand against the kind of tsunami of sexual information and pressure that's coming at them. But you know what? They're up to the task, and we are too, as their parents. And so, teaching our children is the first and best way to win this war. I'm convinced we will win it at home. However, there are things that we need to do policy-wise that will be of great help. First of all, I mentioned comprehensive sexuality education, and I detail that at length in the book and give examples of that. There's also a website I would point people to. That's stopcse.org, stands for Stop Comprehensive Sexuality Education.org. And it gives examples of curriculum, shows the international documents, but behind the children's sexual rights movement and so forth. And then you can click on your state and find out what's happening there. So people need to be aware of the push for CSE, Comprehensive Sexuality Education, and oppose it. I and my colleagues have opposed it here in my local state and legislature. Every couple of years, there's a bill brought forward to enshrine CSE as the method of teaching sexual education at school. And I live in a very red, very conservative state, and still we have to be very vigilant in fighting that. And as you mentioned, in getting truly pornographic materials out of our schools and being vocal until that happens.
Why do you call families invincible?
Well, I fought hard for that title of that book because I thought it was so essential. My message is not, with calling it the Invincible Family, that the family is immune to problems or difficulties or, even great heartache and problems. But my message is that since people spring from other people, the cooperative anatomy of men and women is the thing that creates life, which in turn creates families. And so you really can't stop the family, because it is the thing that is continually brought to the fore. No matter, even if there's, regimes in power or, communist domination or all these things. And even if really bad things happen in our culture or our society, the family is a thing that is always going to rise again. It always will, unless you defeat anatomy, which is another thing that's happening through the transgender agenda right now. But even then, the seeds of life are planted in our bodies, and that the family is reborn every time a baby is born, and that brings with it a whole host of good. Again, not that bad things don't or can't happen in families, but also the best things in life tend to happen in families, and the deepest kind of loves tend to happen in families. And that's something that I think by the design of God is designed to always come back, to always rise again, kind of like the phoenix from the ashes. Even if society falls apart, what's going to rise up again? The family. It will be the family.
Well, I can remember as a youngster growing up, the series on television frequently featured strong nuclear families. Why is the nuclear family under attack? I mean, what is the purpose of it?
Well, it's been said that between the totalitarian state and the individual lies the family. And the family is the protective layer between the state taking over and the private individual. And that the family, it seems like, oh, well, how strong is the family? Well, it turns out it's pretty darn strong. And here's why. I start off my book, The Invincible Family, talking about the bond of mothers and babies. And that seems very commonplace. We tend to take that for granted. But if you think about it, when a baby is born, it's always born to a mother, their mother. It's always a woman. And hopefully there's a man there too, the husband, the father. But there's always a
Sure.
woman. And a woman tends to believe that baby that she has carried and birthed belongs to her. And almost everyone in the world would agree that baby belongs to her. And so what that does is it establishes the idea of privatization. And it orients the world to be governed and managed on a private level, a family level. Now, we have larger level governments in place, but their major role, if they understand it correctly, is to protect the rights of individuals and families. But the family is unique because it always is a stumbling block to the power of the state because it's private, because parents think that their children belong to them, not somebody else, not the state. And so it's very difficult for the state to walk in or any regime of any kind to walk in and say, no, you're going to raise your children like this, because parents say, no, we're not. We're going to teach our children whatever we want. And so this is why collectivist programs have so often failed. It's because of the power of the family. So you asked, why is the family under attack? That's why. Because if there are entities that have global aims, which there are, and many of them are anchored at the United Nations, then they have to weaken and work to destroy the family so that they can usurp then the power that families, the families of the earth, inherently have.
That's one of the best explanations of it I've ever heard. That was very good. Now, when it comes to the feminist movement today, is there a link to socialism there?
Oh, absolutely. And early on in my book, I have a brief chapter kind of going through a crash course on socialism, and then I juxtapose it with feminism. And the connection is so clear. So just in brief, so Karl Marx and his right-hand man, Friedrich Engels, they had this great plan. They thought, okay, well, we'll eliminate private property. The state will just sort of run things. And once everyone isn't competing and no one has more than anyone else, we have, quote, equality, then everyone will just be magically happy, right? But in order to do this, part of what Engels wrote was that for that to happen, that women needed to be, quote, freed from the care of their children so that they could, in his words, participate in socially productive work. So if you look at that argument closely, you see that Marx and Engels are arguing that raising humanity, raising children, is not socially productive work. But if you look even closer, so if you say, okay, well, raising children, raising humanity is just the grunt work. We've got to get women and parents out of that spot and get them into the workforce so that they can contribute to the gross domestic product. Well, then who's taking care of the children? This has been and still remains a key question. And if the parents are not taking care of the children, the state is in the perfect position to usurp the care and teaching of children. In fact, that's what Engels said. He said, in a socialist society, quote, the care and education of children becomes a public affair. And so that's what we've seen happen, even over the past two centuries in our culture and in our nation, is that education of children has become a public affair. And now the move is to make the care of children, even at their youngest ages, a public affair. And guess what? That's bad news, because the state can't raise your child the way a mother can, the way a father can. And the power in the teaching of parents is paramount, and the state can have great influence, but their motives are different. Parents are usually motivated by love, by the love of their children. They want the well-being of their children. Of course, there are terrible parents in the world. We, of course, have to acknowledge that. But most parents, even the data reflects this very clearly, most parents are the best guardians of their children. And the state can't say that. The record of the state in raising children is very bad. Children raised in, communal or adoptive, orphanages, it's fantastically a poor record. That's because the state or state entities can't actually love children and can't care about them the way a parent does. And so the result is different. So if we as a society are saying that we're okay with conceding not only the education, but the care of our little children over to other people, over to non-parents, that is a recipe for disaster.
That's the reason that Vladimir Lenin said, "Give me your children to teach for 4 years, and the seed that I sow will never be uprooted." Recognizing that at that tender, impressionable age, you really had your best chance of molding that child. And
that's exactly
even the
right.
Bible says it too. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. So those early years, those formative years, are so incredibly important. And the concept of children belonging to the whole community and the whole society was just advocated recently by the current president of the United States. He actually made that statement.
Yeah, and when President Biden made that statement recently, it's just rehashing the old same socialist philosophy, that the children belong to all of us. No, they don't. They belong to specific parents because they're born to them and because that matters. Now, of course, we have a social opportunity and responsibility to care for other children in the general sense. Of course, we care about our neighbors' kids, but we don't have the stewardship that we have over our own children. And that matters. And that's intentional, I think, on God's part, because then you see, if every child is loved by his or her parents, and that child's well-being is looked out for specifically by his or her parents, then theoretically, every child has guardians in their life. Now, as we all know, sometimes this system breaks down, but when it does, the results are often negative and very bad for individuals and society. And so when the family model is followed and supported as closely as it can be, of course, allowing for death and divorce happens and different things do happen, and those don't have to be a death sentence to children. But when the family model of parents looking over and caring for and providing for their own children is followed, that brings about the best outcomes and the best supportive human rights for children that is possible. There's a study done, many studies have been done, but one that says that the warmth of a mother's relationship with her child is the biggest predictor of outcomes on all levels for children: emotional, social, and economic success. The warmth of the mother's relationship with her children is the biggest factor affecting the child for the length of the child's life. And so that's something that if we're crafting policy, we need to pay attention to that and support the family, not to treat the family as an enemy to the child, but treat the family as the very best thing for the child in almost all cases.
Absolutely. I mean, I certainly would agree in my own case that it was my mother's influence that made the biggest difference in the life of myself and my brother. And, she had the worst possible circumstances growing up. and then got married and found out that her husband was a bigamist. I mean, she really did not have a whole lot going for her, but she really loved us and she wanted to make sure we were successful. And she got criticized so much. They said, you can't make boys stay in the house and read books. But she got the last laugh because one became a brain surgeon and one became a rocket scientist. So I think maybe she knew what she was talking about.
I think she did. And see, all of the terrible things that your mother was facing, the thing that trumped that all for her, as you said, was her love for her boys, for you. And that mattered. That ended up mattering more than anything else. All those other factors. And now, look at your life, and you're not alone in that. Like George Washington famously said, all that I am, I owe to the teaching of my mother. Same thing with Abraham Lincoln. All that I am, I owe to my angel mother.
Absolutely.
And so, there's something, mother love is held up as kind of the gold standard of love and devotion that, and there's a reason for that, because it is.
Well, just changing directions just slightly here. Why do you think the socialists are so anxious to get rid of God?
Well, that's part of the whole program, right? Marx and Engels, again, in the Communist Manifesto, that's one of the major planks of the platform, is to remove belief in God. And because if someone does not have a core belief about why life matters, kind of the framework for believing why life is even happening, then they are susceptible. They will be searching for a framework to hang their life on, because we crave that kind of order. We crave purpose. We want our lives to matter. And so if God is removed as the purpose for our lives, another thing will be put in its place. And of course, the thing that the socialist movement and communist movement wants to put in the place of that is devotion to the system. These days you could say devotion to equality, devotion to the state. And we've seen that played out time and time again. But devotion to the state, or devotion even to the ideal of equality, is not a good enough reason to hang your life upon. And it becomes empty and hollow. But in the meantime, when you get rid of God for people, it makes them fall prey to all kinds of lesser schemes and ideas, and they're more easily controlled. If they've lost their focus on the fact that God is real and exists and is overseeing the universe and will help you in your individual life, if that's all stripped away, people are going to be grasping for straws, and they'll take whatever you hand them. And so that's, I think the root of why God is pushed out of the picture by these ideologies.
Absolutely. Thinking about socialism and abortion, it seems like the socialists are very pro-abortion. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, a couple of reasons, but going back to our previous conversation about the bond between mothers and babies, abortion is, of course, the ultimate hacking apart of the bond between mother and child, very literally. There's all these ideologies at play to reduce and minimize and short circuit the connection between mothers and children. But abortion accomplishes that immediately and physically. And the arguments that have put forward to women for the reasons why they should abort their own children, they frame women. Then they put the women in positions of being, instead of creators of life, it makes them takers of life, which is one of the most tragic things that can be imagined. And then to get women to celebrate that is just kind of astounding and deeply sad. So there's many reasons why, if you want to reduce love in a society, you can convince women that it's their right to eliminate their own children. And we've seen the damage that many women, that has been done to many women post-abortive, and the
Absolutely.
deep sorrow and regret and tragedy that many women, not all women, but many women feel. And that, again, if you can convince the life givers in society, which are women, that their most celebrated role is to take life instead, that is huge. And that is a huge ideological victory, and for evil forces, in my opinion. And it also defeats
Absolutely.
the woman individually. So I have, quick story here. I have 5 children, 4 daughters, very close in age, and they're all college age now. And then we have a 12-year gap in our family, and then I have a little 6-year-old boy. So we have these older girls, and then this little boy. And I was 42 when I had him. And it was very interesting, just kind of illustrating this principle. It was really interesting to see people's reactions when I turned up pregnant at age 42 and having a baby, and I went to a doctor's appointment, about halfway through my pregnancy, and they were drawing some blood or whatever. And the lab tech who was with me, there was a woman, she's taking my blood, and she said, she found out how old I was, that I was pregnant. And she said, "Oh, if I were you, I'd have to slit my wrists." And I thought, well, I'm not gonna. And I understand that, it would be a shocker for some old women, older as I was, to be pregnant. But the underlying, what you can see there, though, is the underlying, I don't know, feeling that children are a burden rather than a blessing. Now, they are a burden. They're a great responsibility, but they're also a blessing, and the blessing outweighs the burden. And anyone who's had children knows that. And so when even I, and in my circumstances, am getting kind of shocker feedback, like, "Oh my gosh, how could you be pregnant? This is awful." Well, it wasn't. It turns out, although I was myself a little shocked at first, it didn't turn out to be awful. In fact, it turned out to be the greatest thing ever. And we couldn't have imagined how our little guy would just bless and enrich our lives. And that's what so many women are missing out on. They've listened to the rhetoric. They've listened to the story that children are going to rob them of their lives, basically. And once you have a kid, your happy life is over. That's just so far from the truth. Our little guy makes us laugh every day. One example, when he was 4, he and I were at the top of a water slide about to go down together. And just out of the blue, he looks up at me and he says, "Mom, you're my favorite girl in the whole world. I love you more than anyone else." And, my heart's melting. But the thing is, he says stuff like that to me all the time. And that's not unique to me and my son. That happens in all families. That kind of love, you can't buy that kind of love. That's why families exist, in my opinion, to create that kind of love. Like, my son just loves me just because I'm his mom and I take care of him. And I love him in that same intense way that I would give my life for him. And I do, day by day. We all give our lives minute by minute to the people around us. And that's not a bad thing. That makes us more noble, good people, right?
And it's what some of these young women are looking for when they go out and get pregnant, and they don't have a husband. They just want somebody who will love them unconditionally, and that unfortunately turns out not to be so good for the kid a lot of the times. And that's why the whole family structure is so vitally important. But the other thing about abortion, it makes people more callous toward life. And as we've grown more callous toward the concept of life, our relationships with each other have come into question. And I think that's one of the reasons there's so much division and hatred in our country right now. The reason that we see all of these mass shootings, people have just lost their love and their respect for each other. Instead of love your neighbor or cancel your neighbor, all of these things, I think, are related. And it's a very sad time, but people like yourself who are out there fighting, warriors who are talking about this, people who have courage, that's what's going to make the difference for us as a nation. Now, the next thing I wanted to ask you about is the trans movement. Completely non-scientific. We already know that if you have
Mm-hmm.
two X's, as far as your chromosomal pattern is concerned, you're female. And if you have an X and a Y,
Mm-hmm.
you're a male. And we've known what males and females
Mm-hmm.
were for thousands of years. And now all of a sudden, we don't know anymore. How does that impact the family?
Well, it impacts it in really kind of sneaky ways, and I spend a chapter on this in the book. I spend one chapter talking about the gay movement, the LGBT movement, and how that was all packaged together. And then the next chapter talks about transforming the argument and the trans movement, and how it's very tricky, right? Because the L, the G, the B, and the T were all put in one lump sum, and we were meant to accept them as one thing. But what we're discovering is that they're not at all the same. And I highlighted this in the book, because same-sex attraction is based on the idea that that same-sex attraction is a biological phenomenon. And there's disagreement about that. Most people think there's a lot of different factors that go into that. Perhaps biological is one of them. And so then if it is biological, then the argument is that should be honored. Well, if you then are going to be consistent in your arguments, and you look to the T, the transgender movement, that is a different argument altogether. That changes the body and the biology from being the expert that we honor to being the enemy that we have to change. And so it's completely different argument. It's non-biological. It's based on something that could be considered even more religious than anything else, a belief about, that there is a possibility that you could even be born in the wrong body. Well, how would that happen? Who's in charge of putting your essence into a body if that's in fact how it happens? So anyway, so that's kind of, I think the trans movement rode in on the heels of the gay movement, which there may be some elements of the gay movement and that are valid. But the trans movement came in on those coattails, and everyone just tended to accept that when we shouldn't have, because they are totally different, and their ideologies are divergent in almost every way. And you asked how this impacts the family, and it's really interesting. So even the word same-sex attraction, same-sex marriage, that idea upholds the reality that there is, in fact, an opposite sex, a set sex, and one that is opposite to that. These days, people call that binary. So in a same-sex ideology, the idea of the binary is very clearly upheld, because same-sex and then opposite sex means something. But in the trans movement, that doesn't exist at all. And so now we see that a portion of the population no longer believes that women exist as physically as a class of people or men. And so then and legal movements are beginning to support this, right? That you can't really tell from the body of a person doesn't indicate their maleness or femaleness. Well, if that's true, it isn't true, but it's being taken as true. So if that is true, then laws are beginning to be framed in such a way that it's at the very least culturally inappropriate, and the worst, illegal, to differentiate someone based on their body, to differentiate between someone being a male and a female. And if you can no longer differentiate between males and females, of course, there's many issues, the bathroom issue, sports issue, all these other issues, but there's a deeper issue, and that's with the family. Because if you can't legally define or defend what a male is or what a female is, then it also becomes very tricky to define and defend what a mother is or a father is, because mother is a sex-specific designation, and so is father. Sex specific. And so if those things, if we can't talk about those things or make legal decisions based on those things anymore, everything is up in the air. Everything is up for grabs. And so the family, the whole idea of who is a parent, who is a mother, who is a father, begins to entrench upon parental rights. And And I don't even think we've seen the beginning of how this is going to affect family law. Of course, we're already seeing how the trans movement is breaking up families in convincing children to disavow their parents if their parents believe that they are the sex that they are. And so, of course, it's ripping up families one by one. But the thing I'm concerned, I am very concerned about that, but more broadly, I'm also concerned about the legal movements that are working to unhinge the family and unhinge parental rights, based on the fact that, on the belief that male and female don't matter and don't exist.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I just want to ask you before we close, uh, any parting thoughts? And before you give us those, where can people get your book?
Oh, thank you. My website is invinciblefamily.com. You can find it there. It's also on Amazon. That's the easiest place, Amazon Prime. Invinciblefamily.com not only has my book, but also there's a link to all of my articles that might be helpful to people, kind of bite-sized pieces. And just sort of wrapping up, I want to go back to what you were saying a moment ago, that, a lot of this, we see the fabric of society unraveling at the seams. And there's many reasons for that, but I think the main reason for that is the unraveling of the family, specifically the mother-child bond. There's a psychologist whose work I love and often quote, it's Erica Komazar, and she says that many of the problems that we're seeing today are the effects of maternal absence on our children. And she calls maternal absence one of the greatest social issues of our times. And she's a left-leaning woman. She's a left-leaning psychologist. But in her 25 years of practice, she has seen the devastation that comes to children when their mothers are not there. Now, that doesn't mean that mom can't ever work. And that's not my message. But when a child is consistently with their mother in their earliest years, their first 3 to 4 years of life, the effect is profound. And when mother is not there, not just in the room, but emotionally present for her child, the child's mind is oriented in an entirely different way. And they feel valued and loved in a way that no one else can produce for them. And so I think that, we're all alarmed at the decay of society, which has just seemed to happen at such a rapid rate. I believe much of what we're seeing is the result of the absence of mothering and fathering, because it matters more than anything else. So, but the hopeful thing is that means it's fixable, because we as mothers and fathers, we're in the driver's seat. And if we can entice and invite people back to the family and to see the family as a social good and as mothering and as fathering as a productive and good way to spend your life, a worthwhile way to spend years of your life is mothering and fathering, then we can turn it around. We really can. And so although we're concerned, I'm still hopeful.
Just want to thank our wonderful guest, Kimberly Ells, who has just done a fantastic job of highlighting the role of the family in our society, why it's under attack. And please go out and get her book and continue to follow her and encourage her in what she's doing. It's a very important part of what's happening to our society. And for your prescription for this week, back in high school, remember reading the book by George Orwell, Animal Farm? It was really about socialism. And if you haven't read it in a long time, or if you've never read it, go and read that book. There's a lot of things that are going on in our society today that you will recognize. And it's very important to be able to see before these things happen what is happening so that you can react the right way and prepare yourself. Animal Farm by George Orwell. And while you're at it, read 1984 too. Same author, a very similar theme. It's good to know about this stuff. And Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky will tell you exactly what's going on right now It's very nice to know about these things. That's going to be it for this week. Don't forget Apple Podcasts you can get for free, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you don't miss any episodes. Tell your friends and family, rate us, review us, and let's do all that we can to spread common sense. Let's make common sense again. And that's it for now. Remember the cornerstones: faith, liberty, community, and life. See you next week.